Continuing with season previews, I want to talk about Boston. So we're doing this in alphabetical order, which means Buffalo, Calgary, yada yada. You guys know how that works. Boston's an interesting one because they made the Stanley Cup Finals this year, and the expectation's going to be, hey, these guys are going to be great, and they may very well be. Boston could finish as high as first in their division. They could. Because I believe Tampa Bay, having watched what happened in the playoffs last year, I think there's going to be some more pacing themselves going on with them. A little less going out all out every single night trying to win as many games as possible. I think Tampa's going to take a bit of a step back. But the Bruins may be due for a step back themselves. Last year, 107 points. The year before, 112. The year before that, 95. The year before that, 93. And the year before that, 96. 93 and 96, they didn't make the playoffs with those point totals. So, while the Bruins are thought of as, yes, they're a slam dunk, they're a playoff team, 100%, these guys are great, look what they did to go to the Stanley Cup Finals. I'm great with all that. That sentiment's awesome, but there's some realities with this team that leave me wondering, are they vulnerable to falling back this season? Because it's going to happen at some point. And historically, if you've been following my season by season history videos, Boston will just fall off a cliff. They'll be having everything's great, everything's fine, and then all of a sudden they go right off the cliff. They were 11th in goals for with 259. Their offense is not a concern. They were 4th in goals against at 215. They had a really good shot at first, and then the last couple of weeks of the season, it fell apart for them. But their defense is pretty good. Their offense is pretty solid. There really isn't anything in their game to look at and say, there's a glaring weakness with the Boston Bruins. When you look at their record month by month this past season, at the end of October, they were 7-3-2. End of November, 14-7-4. End of December, 21-14-4. End of January, 27-17-7. End of February, 38-17-9. End of March, 47-23-9. And at the end of April, so the end of the regular season, 49-24-9. So overall, solid record. They had solid months the whole way through. There were some concerns I had right around December that maybe they were going to end up falling out of a playoff spot because the East, it's tough to make the playoffs in the East. Very, very tough, and I don't think it's going to get any easier this coming season. They have made the playoffs 3 straight years, which doesn't sound like as many as people would imagine, right? Because you remember them winning the Stanley Cup in 2011, being in the finals in 2013. Now they're in the finals from 2019, but in between there were some tough times. In the finals, of course, as stated this past June, round 2 in 2018 before they got knocked out by Tampa. 2017, they get knocked out in round 1. 2016 and 2015, they're out of the playoffs. So for Boston, are they a juggernaut? Not really, not in my eyes. And I know there's people who are sick of them, but I've seen some wobbles from this franchise, and we may see another one this year. I don't know. Out of the lineup, notables. Notable to me is Marcus Johansson for what he did during the playoffs. The other notable to me is that David Backes is not out. After the way last season ended, after the fact that against his St. Louis Blues, the team that he was the face of for a very decent amount of time, Backes is up in the press box. They didn't actually buy him out, and he's still on the roster as far as they're concerned. He's still part of the solution, not part of the problem, at least potentially. We'll see whether or not that comes back to bite them. That's one of those moves they've made that I'm curious about. Goals leader, I expect that to be David Pastrnak. If Pasta's on, he can score 50. He can. 40 is kind of a given. 50 is there for him too. Dark horse, I went with Carson Kuhlman as a dark horse. Played very well in the playoffs. It was either him or Clifton, and I thought, I'll go with Kuhlman. And my what about on this team is Urho Vakanainen. This is a very deep defense. It has to be because last season they had a ton of injuries to this blue line. So we saw just how deep they are on the blue line, just how many defensemen they have to have. But maybe this year, knock on wood, we can avoid some of those injury concerns for the Boston Bruins, and we can see them take a step forward, and maybe Vakanainen steps in should they end up having to move on from somebody else. And trade bait, I have David Krejci up there. Why Krejci? I think, in all honesty, with Torrey Krug's contract coming up next season, and there's some, or next summer, I should say, and there's some belief that, well, they could look to cost cut. Krejci's name comes up often when they're talking about doing cost cutting. Krejci had a very good season. This might be the best time to look into a trade with him, if possible. And I think the organizational depth is there, but only if. And I don't have Jacob Forsbacka Karlsson on the board. I should, so I'll just put it up here as this. JFK may be part of the solution, but there's a lot of different names here, and one of them, odds are, ends up becoming the solution. Now, your first line: Marchand, Bergeron, and Pastrnak. No, not perfection line. No. BMP, you could call them MBP, PBM, PMB. Make up some kind of. Don't call them the perfection line, please. Just stop it. I got mad during the playoffs about it. I don't like it. You call a team's first line the perfection line, and players hear that, man. Players hear it. Second line, I went with DeBrusk, Krejci, and I went with Backes, even though the site I used for this, which was Daily Faceoff, they had Coleman on the second line. Coleman's interesting on the second line. I think Backes is going to get a shot at top 6 minutes out of the gate. I don't think he stays there. I'm not crazy. I don't think he stays there. He had 7 goals last year. But I think with the amount of money they're spending him and the amount of faith that Don Sweeney showed in him, I think he's going to get a shot at it. Heinen, Coyle, and Coleman then becomes your third line. And this third line is good enough to get almost as much ice time as the second. And this top 9 in general is pretty solid. If Heinen comes in and plays an entire year the way he did the second half of this past season and the way he did in the first half of the season before that, we get a complete season out of him where he's on top of his game. He's an excellent top 9 player. And of course, Coyle showed in the playoffs. He's pretty solid. And I think if he does well this year, Boston may look to lock him up long term. Fourth line then would be Chris Wagner or Joachim Nordstrom, Sean Kuraly or Par Lindholm. I'm going to go with Kuraly on that one. And either Brett Ritchie or Bjork, JFK. See, this is the thing. This is where it gets tricky. I love Forsbacka Karlsson. I do. And I think he has a lot of potential to eventually be a number 2 center. But there's just so many players ahead of him. Trent Frederick down the middle. He scored 0 points in the 15 games he played. His numbers were kind of ugly. But you know what? He's still learning the game. And he's in the midst of a bit of a transition. I still think he's got some good game in there. We'll see. But Frederick could be decent. So with Zach Senyshyn in there as well, and as mentioned before, Bjork, there's some unrealized, untapped potential there. Senyshyn had 1 goal in 2 games that he played. Very small sample size. And he's, to me, still remembered as we got him instead of Barzal. That's kind of been his name since they drafted him. And I don't know that he'll ever shake that for me. But if he develops into a decent bottom 6 forward, because I don't see the top 6 potential there, and I just don't. If he develops into a good bottom 6 forward, I'm happier with that. Blue line is pretty solid and pretty deep. So you got Chara and McAvoy. McAvoy, of course, currently right now is restricted free agent. Chara is in his last year. He's in his final year. I expect to see his ice time cut back a lot. The tricky part is Krug and Carlo being the second pairing. Now, you can switch Chara and Krug, but if you overplay Krug 5-on-5, your defense is going to get worse. I love Torrey Krug. He's one of my favorite defensemen in the league. 5-on-5, he can be a misadventure. He can be tough to watch at times. Carlo is that good defensively sound defender who's only 22 years of age. He's only going to get better. Grzelcyk and Clifton. Grzelcyk is your wild card. When we talk about Chara being in his last year, which he very highly likely is, Grzelcyk is the guy who can step into a top 4 role next season. So while John Moore and Kevin Miller are here as veterans, Moore stepped in the playoffs here and there where needed. Kevin Miller was injured for a great portion of last season and, of course, throughout the playoffs. I don't know that Miller necessarily has a spot on the team right now. I look at this blue line and I say, you know what? Clifton was really solid. Grzelcyk proved he belongs. Moore was a decent enough fill-in. Some misadventure with him if you overplay him, but if you play him sparsely, pretty good. And so I'm not sure there's there's room there for Miller. I haven't been a huge Kevin Miller fan from the beginning, but that's okay too. Vakanainen and Kampfer. I stated my support of Vakanainen earlier, and Kampfer, he was a good fill-in as well. He does for Boston much like what Alex Biega does for the Canucks. If you need him, he can step in, and he doesn't really hurt you having him out there on the ice. And of course, Zboril is still waiting his opportunity. We have him instead of Besser or Konechny in my eyes. That was a rough draft. But the fact that all three guys who were drafted by Don Sweeney that year are at least in the conversation for spots on the roster, it's not a complete loss. It's not quite Barzal and Konechny along with DeBrusk and what that would have done for the roster. I just salivate at the idea. On the back end of things, you got Tuukka Rask, Jaro Halak. Jaro Halak coming off of one of the best years he's ever had. He outplayed Rask for much of last year. Rask, of course, came into his own in the playoffs, played fantastic. Right from about Game 3 against Columbus, right through the Stanley Cup Final, he was really, really solid. And so that's your tandem. Daniel Vladar seems to be the one that they're getting ready to be a goaltender. And every time that I look at, and I've seen this a few times now, where, okay, what are the Seattle salmon? What are the Seattle fish sticks going to be after from Boston? And every time I see a protected list from anybody, I see Vladar as being the one that the Bruins protect instead of Rask. And when a Bruins fan says there's no way, people go, hey, that's 2 years from now. Okay? They'll be protecting Vladar. No. I don't care how old Rask's going to be in 2 years. I don't know that I see him as a goaltender at the NHL level who's going to be a starter. He had an .898 save percentage last year in the AHL. So I'm holding off on any belief that Vladar is going to be the next big goalie for Boston. And I've mentioned a few times, I do have concern about Boston's future when it comes to net minding. I trust Don Sweeney. He's been excellent when it comes to putting this team together. When you look at their blue line and you look at their forward group, you can point out some gray beards in there and say, well, they're going to fall apart. I could also point out a lot of youth throughout the lineup. Sweeney's been very smart about making sure there's always youth coming into the lineup and that these young guys are given a chance to succeed and a chance to play a lot. So we'll see whether or not Boston's able to do that this year as well as they did last year. I do expect somewhat of a fallback from them, but my most likely finish for them is really all over the place. They could finish as high as first. 107 points this past season, 112 the year before that. I don't see anything wearing down in this roster other than you could say, well, Chara's wearing down. Yeah, and there are other guys who can step in. There are plenty of other guys who can step in. So if Chara comes in and he's slow and he can't do it, there are plenty of other players who can step in and play defense for the Bruins this year. Bergeron's older. I do have concerns about his ability to remain healthy for a full 82 games. The thing is, when Bergeron's out, somehow Boston makes it work. And their record without Bergeron in the lineup is pretty good. I could see them finishing as low as fourth. In most of the standings that I've done, I've had Tampa first, Toronto second, Florida third, and Boston fourth. And that's the same standings that I had last summer, where, of course, Florida dramatically underachieved, and Toronto was not quite better than Boston. Toronto was really close, though, and it's easy to forget that. But while Toronto, I think, got their blue line into a better position for this season's regular season, Boston, I could see there being a bit of a clawback. But again, if Tampa paces themselves a bit, and if Toronto has their fumbles, especially if they start the year without Marner, you could see Boston winning their division, which, based on the 28-19 playoffs, means they'd be out in the first round. The league has never had parity like this. That's why I'm doing my finishes like this, because we are really in an age where it's almost impossible to tell who's going to finish where. So there you go. Season preview for the Boston Bruins. I'm anxious. I do not expect another finals appearance for Boston this year, but I expect a pretty good season and to watch as some of these kids come along. Let me know what you guys think, where you think the lines are going to end up. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing right through. You just happened upon this video. And hey, thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support, and I'll talk to you again soon.